Hello, my name is Denise Lindeman, and I'm one of the members here at Desert Grace. I'm excited to share this Sunday message with you. Would you take a moment right now to subscribe to our channel? And if you like this video, be sure to give us a thumbs up so that we know you've been blessed. You can do those things below.
This morning I wondered if you had ever heard of what's known as memory sport. It's a competition, and these competitions, known as memory sport, have been around since the early 1990s. Now, I could never have imagined such a thing. I wouldn't have ever figured that there was yet another sport that I wouldn't be any good at. Thought I'd kind of already gone through that realm of things. But here's basically what happens. If you are a world-class athlete in memory sport, you will be gathered together where you will then attempt to memorize and then recall different forms of information under some very specific rules. So in a sense, you will be given 5 categories of things which you then compete against other memory athletes to see if you could do really, really well. All right? Serious world-class competitors can memorize a deck of shuffled cards in 23 seconds. How long would it take you to memorize a deck of shuffled cards? The first thing I would say is if I wanted to, it would take a while. And knowing me, I would think I just about have it. And I'm not mentioning any names because all 6 of them, maybe even 7, or possibly everyone else in my household would love to come and just switch 1 or 2 of the cards. I just saying, if that was something that my goal was and I went through it every night, eventually that's exactly what would happen. I won't point any fingers because I don't have that many, but that's beside the point. And not only can they memorize a deck of cards in basically 20 seconds, they can name 30 random people in 60 seconds in order. So in other words, they give them the names of 30 people in a specific order, and they have basically memorized them in a minute. So for those of you that are like, I can't even remember everybody at church, join the club. We are not memory athletes. Just telling you. They can figure out an 80-digit number, memorize it in 21 seconds. I could remember 80 in that length of time. They can remember 48 random words in sequence in just 59 seconds. So they can do that in less than a minute. 48 random words. Now, I'm not even sure if you told me a sentence that I was familiar with that had 48 words, I could repeat it to you exactly in 59 seconds. Let me just go with that. The order of 30 random images, like a sunset, a cow, a bridge, a car, a road, whatever. 30 random images in 14 seconds and be able to repeat those to you. It's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy. That's all I got to say. And there's the source. If you wondered where I got all this information from, I tried to put it with the HTTPS, but the system kept trying to pull up a website, and I'm like, so there you go. I just want you to know I'm not making this up. All right? That's simple. Well, it once wasn't the case. Most of us at this point have a hard time remembering our own telephone number. Don't know about you, and it's not because we have gotten so much older. I had a birthday yesterday, so I'm feeling that whole year older, all the way up at 48 now. Yeah. But anyway, it's not that I'm so much older that keeps me from being able to remember my phone number. It's that we don't have use to dial the numbers anymore. Because when was the last time you picked up your cell phone and said, oh, I need to call my friend. Let me dial their number. You just find their name and push. Or if you're more sophisticated, you push the button and go, call Laura. And it happens. Just saying. I've thought about this. Would you remember the numbers to your closest friends? I know you've all memorized the phone number for the church. I don't need to question you on that one. You know it. In case you ever get hospitalized or have a prayer request, you've got it memorized, right? Yeah, you don't, because you never call. I'm just saying. Now, I want you to try to remember, we were in the book of Joshua. We had gone all the way through chapter 3. Chapter 1 is basically Joshua receiving his call, receiving his charge. The goal is to get Israel, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, across the Jordan and into the promised land. Afterwards, which Joshua says, all right, in 3 days, tell everybody, 3 days, we're going to go across. And so the next chapter is Rahab and these sort of bumbling spies, and that's a really good one, but she's going to be protected when Jericho goes down. And one of the key points of that is that God uses anybody to go and encourage the Israelites that it's going to be okay, because she says, look, everybody is so afraid of you because they've heard of what God is doing for you. And she gives an incredible confession of faith in the middle of that. And then we finally made it to chapter 3, which was so long in the making, 40 years for Israel. And we got to see the water heaping up and the ark being brought into the center, and then all of Israel crossing along. So great. He is so wonderful. My question for us this morning is, why should memory stones be important to us as we journey with God? You're going to see in just a minute, in the midst of the passage, that God tells Joshua that he wants him to be very careful and very intentional in making sure this is memorialized. And so in the midst of this, there's something that God is also speaking to us. Because this is, again, not just merely a history. It's not merely something that we are looking at as just sort of a history lesson. It is, but it's more theology. Joshua chapter 4. We're only going to read the first 9 verses this morning. It says this: When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up the 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and to carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. And now, if you keep reading, it's going to tell you a few other things that happened, and one of them is that the priests finally get to stop standing there holding the Ark of the Covenant and make it all the way across, and that the whole of Israel gets across, and that there's stones that are brought into the camp and set up, and that basically the purpose of the stones is that there will be a memory of what God has done by crossing over Israel into the promised land. That's essentially what the rest of the chapter says, again with sort of some back and forth kind of repeating themes, because this is theology rather than history. So we get to the beginning of chapter 4, it says the whole of Israel has come across, and then chapter 4 begins with the exact same phrase. Only then there's sort of a pause in the forward action. There's sort of this moment in which we say, okay, now let's look back for just 1 second and see something that happened that we don't want you to miss. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out. And the first one would be simply this. God's instruction to Joshua to choose one person from each tribe is so that there would be unity among Israel. That there's not just this simple idea of, well, we need one for each tribe because so if you were to say, I want to buy something for the children in my family, and I'm not talking bad about my children. This is a hypothetical sort of case, okay? I'm not necessarily saying my children would ever do this. But there are certain things which simply they won't share well. Do you know what I'm saying? That you couldn't buy, say, one ice cream cone and say each one of you just take a lick and pass it around until you're all done. Or if your kids are like mine in a hypothetical situation like I'm referring to, you couldn't buy just one copy of a book you wanted them all to have an opportunity to read because it will go missing. Theoretically, should your children not share well? Not that I'm telling a true story. I'm just saying that this is not what God is doing here, where you can't have the tribes having one stone to remind them of this thing, that in fact what the point is that there are 12 tribes that cross over, including 2 that really belong on the east side. But there are 12 tribes that are crossing over. They are one united family, and God did this for all of them. It's important that we get this. Joshua spoke in chapter 3 of 7 different nations being within the land. And now Israel is coming in to replace them as a united group of tribes. There is a unity in what's happening, whereas currently in there is a diversity. There are 7 different nations, and now they are being replaced with one, even if it is comprised of 12 tribes. So part of the symbolism here is that they are united, that they are together. It's interesting to me because there are so few details about how these guys are chosen. And now that's where my imagination sort of has to take over. I don't really have another option there. Because if God doesn't say, all right, you need to choose them, and Joshua doesn't say, so we went to the elders and we picked the most noble man in each one. My guess is it went something like this. Here's a job. I need the strongest man you have. The one that, when you need something moved up the stairs or, across the room or back and forth across the church campus, this is the guy you're going to call. Because he's going to have to put a big old stone up on his shoulder and carry it all by himself into camp. That's my guess. That's just sort of what I'm doing. Now, I don't know if you noticed that this actually dates back to the last chapter. In Joshua 3, chapter 12, Joshua suddenly says, now pick 12 men from among you and just go pick 12 men. And he leaves it there. So we didn't even talk about it last week because he didn't give a purpose. And of course, we were going to talk about it this week, so why talk about it last week? That would be redundant. Start to be like the book itself, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So you have these guys that are obviously really strong. I'm thinking, to have this big boulder up on your shoulder. And I'm thinking these were probably really big stones. They didn't go out there and find a little river rock and pick it up and go, okay. Try to balance it up there. I'm thinking these are some big, There's also a symbolicism here because there's unity in the recognition of Joshua as their leader. We're going to talk about this probably more than once today because it's such an important theological point in the story. But in chapter 1, one of the key points is that Joshua is the leader chosen by God. It's a theological fact, not a just merely historical fact. Now we see there is this unity because Joshua is the one who is doing the leading, now with God as his director. But Joshua is the one who has told them to move forward. Joshua is the one who has said, go on and choose these 12 men. Joshua is the one who is saying for God, this is what it means to have the 12 stones. And you have Israel not necessarily going, well, who are you to tell us what to do? Who are you to decide that now is the right time? Who are you to make all these decisions? And again, there's this idea of the whole nation going across. So they all make it over. And at that point, they are seeing Joshua exactly as they saw Moses. And while they may not have necessarily always liked what Moses had to say, or that things weren't happening as quickly as they would have liked, they saw him as their God-appointed leader. And now you have the same thing with Joshua. I want to make sure that we understand that what's being said here is that all of this unity, all of what's going on, this whole miracle that just happened, everything boils down to one thing. Joshua is successful because Yahweh is calling the shots. And all of Israel is looking and saying, this is true. This is the case. This is what is going on. So God's use of the 12 stones is to be a sign to remind the nation of God's power and activity. Don't know if you've ever been in the presence of something that God has done and where you can say, this is nothing short of a miracle. Or this is nothing short of God having done something incredible. And when that occurs, we find ourselves at a point of saying, this was God. So the people, as they just get crossed over, and they're finally, after 40 years of wandering around physically in the promised land, probably waiting eagerly to see what God is about to do next, they probably don't need much of a reminder or much of a sign about what just happened. But God says, you need these stones. It's interesting to me that the exact placement of the stones is really never fully described. And what I mean by that was, it says that he sets them up at Gilgal, and there's other stuff you'll see later, and they're not even sure where some of these places are, but it doesn't say that he set them up in the shape of the ark. It doesn't say whether they were stacked up like one on top of the other, or that he made some sort of little pyramid with them, or whatever else. It just says that he placed them there as a memory, as a marker, as a sign from God. That's sort of an interesting thought. Now, however it's done, he knows that children someday will go, what is that pile of rocks there? Why is that there? And parents will be able to use that, but that's part of it. It's sort of something interesting that scholars say there are two different traditions that are passed down. In one of them, there is a memory stone sitting in the water at the place where the priests stood. In the other, it was in camp. And it seems like both can be supported in the text, which make them wonder, were there actually two sets of stones? Did they first mark out the place within the river so that should they see it when the river is low, they would be reminded? And then also in where they were, that God's presence is still with them and that God is always active. The memorial would remind those who were there. There's no doubt about that. We have memorials. We know what they mean. We tend to erect things, memorials, objects to remember. And I think of some of them that have been maybe a little more recent, the 9/11 memorials, where they took pieces of the building and sent them to cities, and you can see them. There's one in Gila Bend that you drive by anytime you go through Gila Bend. Whether or not you notice it or not is a whole other story, but it's sitting there. It's present. I understand there's one in Yuma. I don't remember exactly where, but they're around. There are more war memorials. There are those things when you're traveling that say historical marker. I don't know how often you stop to look at those. The point is that you would remember something that occurred that you weren't there for. That plays into the story. You see, memories are important things to remind us, not just for those of us that were there, but for those who come behind. Because if you weren't there, you're going to need some sort of interpretation. If you ever stop at the roadside marker, or a couple of rest stops I've stopped at, it talks about this area was once this or that. And you stand there and you read it and you begin to understand a little more. But if you were there and you see the stones and you know where the stones came from and you know what they represent, you don't have to interpret anything. This was when God did something incredible. The memorial would also teach those that would follow. Inevitably, there are those times when there's probably some children in this group that are so young, they have no idea that God is in the midst of a miracle, and they are a part of it. And they have no clue that in these moments that they were part of something so incredibly special that they aren't even seeing it. But then there's all of those who are born after the fact, who know nothing other than the promised land. I guess this would be a little bit like if you're like really old like me at 48. The children that live in my house don't know a world where computers aren't everywhere. Inside the house even, where you can just use it. I remember the 500 years ago when I went to school, and we got to actually go. There wasn't a pandemic. Computers? Not even the teacher had one. We had these things, they were called textbooks. And we had paper and pencil. I missed the part where you had the inkwell in the desk. My kids don't think so. I'm back of the day when you actually had to learn how to write in cursive. Many years ago. How about cell phones? I get so annoyed when I see a 2-year-old with a cell phone. I just want to reach over and snap it and hand it to the parent and say, you don't want to do what you're doing. But it's a different world today. And to remember what things would look back like, I don't know, like a record would be to my kids. And don't worry, kids, you are going to get up, you guys are going to have children, and they're going to be like, what? You did what back then? Pencils were what? You actually had to type with your hand? What? You mean back in my day when the TV was like 8 channels? When I was a kid? Now we're riding down the highway and the kids are always like, well, play this song. Like, I wish I had that when I was a kid. Play the song I like. My parents would have hit me, but that's all right. We play the songs we like. Chapter 4 not only explains once that the purpose of the stones is to teach, it does it twice. In fact, it's how Joshua explains this is the point of the stones. It's so that when your kids ask you, you will say, once upon a time, God was here, and he came in this incredible way, and he moved the water and held it back while we all crossed away. And then we had guys that picked up those stones from the middle of the river, right where the priests were standing with the Ark of the Covenant, and they picked up the stones and they brought them here. Those are stones from the Jordan River that were pulled on the day when the waters were gone and it was totally dry. And these big burly guys put him up on their shoulders and they brought him in and they set him up. That's what it's all about. You see, The stones represent to those who weren't there that God is a God who keeps his promises, not necessarily on our time, but on his. And that God is a God who keeps his promises, not necessarily how we would think he would, but how he will do it. God is a God who keeps his promises regardless. And these stones are a reminder that God is good. I think it's interesting that the memorial would be a lasting reminder of God's actions. It's something that will remind us forever of what God did. You know. It's interesting because the writer is so confident that this is going to be such an incredible thing. It's going to be a reminder that God has been working since Abraham when he first said to Abraham, I am going to make you into a great nation. You're going to have more descendants than you could ever imagine, and you could even count. And you are going to be the first person. From Abraham through the rescue in Egypt, through the crossing over events. Remember, they crossed through the Red Sea. They crossed through the Jordan on dry ground. That's what these stones represent. That's what you are to remember. Israel's going to be telling this story, and in the midst of it, they're going to be reminded of the Ark of the Covenant. The kids would probably say, oh, I would love to see that. What an incredible thing. And they would be reminded even of the priests holding the ark. And I don't know if it was a difficult thing or whether it was really easy to stand there holding the ark while so many people passed through. I don't know if their legs got tired or what happened when they needed to use the restroom. Did they trade? Go use the outhouse, and which side would they go to? Sorry. Side tangent there. But they would be reminded of important leaders. They'd be reminded of God's action. They'd be reminded of what's going on. And again, that verse 9 says it right there. The stones are still there, and they remain there to this day. They're still there. They're still a part of our history. They're still a part of what's going on, even as this is being written. It's a great thing. Joshua and the nation of Israel prove themselves fast to obey. A certain part of me thinks that this is also part of the meaning of the stones, right? That they obeyed God as well. That it's written in this book that God said, do this, and they did. There's nothing in there to say, all right, well, they forgot to do it. Or they got lazy and said, we have so many other things to carry across with us that we decided that we just wouldn't do it. It's simply, God tells Joshua, this is what you're to do. Joshua tells the people, this is what you're to do. They go out and do it, and they obey because God said so. That's it. It's so important that we recognize this. And again, it goes to Joshua's leadership. It goes to how we ought to live today as well. Are we living in a way that really presents God as somebody who's worthy to be obeyed? Israel obeys Joshua, and because they're obeying Joshua, they're also obeying the Lord because they do exactly what they have been instructed to do. You'll notice in this story, there's nothing that says Joshua had to send some of the guys back because they didn't quite get it right the first time. Maybe he did. It's just not in the story, but I'm just thinking that they did what they were supposed to. By the end of Joshua chapter 4, the miracle, the event itself ends. The nation is safely across the river, including everybody. And the river returns to its normal flood stage place. You get the picture here. It happens sort of over 2 chapters, and it sort of kind of goes back and forth a little bit, but Israel has left the wandering of the wilderness, and they have entered the promised land because God has done something so incredible. That God essentially opens the door and keeps it open for everybody to go across. And by the way, if you don't catch this, catch it now. When it goes back to normal, There's no turning back. You hear what I'm saying? We are moving forward at this place. The final tribes to cross the river, it says a little later in chapter 4, where the warrior tribes, they were ready because when they get across, what's the next thing that's going to happen? They are going to get rid of all the inhabitants, those 7 nations that are not together, that are not God-fearing, that they will become the tool of judgment that God intends them to be, and they will be wiped away. That's the last people to cross over. The priests are the last one to come up out of the river, obviously. And I don't know, because the Bible doesn't tell us that if at the very moment the last one began to step out, that the waters came rushing down, or whether the water began as they started to walk, and then it got a little higher, and a little higher, and a little higher, and the last guy got his feet a little wet. Not important. Everybody is where God wants them to be, and He is still with them. The miracle is complete. Everything is the way God wants it to be, including He is giving them the land. And I want you to fast forward to the following generations, and you will find that the memory of the stones and the event is gone. The memory of what happened on those days is gone. It doesn't matter that God said, there's the stones, remember. The memory has faded. It's gone. I know I'm reading ahead. Be nice to stop here and go, and for the rest of the days of their lives, all of Israel, up until today, looked at the stones, remembered what God did, and God just kept doing things like that. No. Joshua by the way, we know this from Judges 2. Judges chapter 2 kind of goes through this. Joshua lives to 110, and then he dies. After that, it says that the elders kind of continued his legacy and kind of continued what was going on for a while. But ultimately, there became a new generation, and apparently, they weren't asking the question, what is that pile of stones over there? In fact, they might have said, you know what, those would make a great art project. Maybe we should take a chisel and try to break them apart. See what's in them. They don't look like they're from around here. He then sees this generation that has no memory of this pile of rocks, no memory of these events, and really no knowledge of God. In fact, when you get to Judges 2:10, it says the new generation neither knew the Lord nor what He did for Israel. Ouch. Ouch. Because I know that those of you at home in particular have been shouting, amen, they all got across. And the room's a little quieter because I'm preaching. But those at home have been jumping up and down, and they've been so excited. They're afraid to even get up and go to the bathroom. This has been such good stuff. And you get to this part, and it just feels like the wind is taken out of the sails. We would like to stop with that, and they all lived happily ever after, right? But then I go up and bring up Judges 2. Why should memory stones, be important to us as we journey with God? I got to tell you, I think we really suck at memory stones, by the way. But here's the first thing. Memory stones should be important to us today because memory fades tomorrow. And again, I'm not simply talking about Oh, we get so many things packed into our brains, we don't remember what happens. I think what happens instead is that we get so excited when God is in the midst of doing the miracle that we can't wait but to be so excited about what's going on. And we are so thrilled about what God is doing that there's no chance that we're going to forget what God just did that was so incredibly wonderful. But some time is going to pass. Maybe even a generation is going to pass. Maybe even a bunch of things will pass. And we'll find ourselves saying something a little more like this if God feels far away. What have you done for me lately, O Lord? When maybe what we ought to be doing is looking back at the memory stones and going, look at what God has been doing. Look at where God was here with me then, and here with me then, and here with me then, and here with me then. And by the way, this works for the community too. Here with us. Not because we want to go back there, but because we want God to continue to be at the forefront of our minds. I want you to think about a little bit of church. I've heard stories about how this church was founded and how it met a period of time in a funeral home, and met a period of time in a school, and then finally there was a building, and the kitchen was a nursery. I hate to tell you this, most of the people that lived through that are gone. Now, I know those stories because they've been passed on from person to person, but give another generation, and my guess is, well, what do you mean? The church has always been here. Forget about the fact that some men, some women, some people who were very faithful with their finances built the building. We'll forget what God was doing in the lives of the church. It's not that long ago that we felt so under the pressure of debt. I remember getting up in front of the congregation and saying, I feel like God has told us within 5 years we could pay this off. I remember some people looking back at me like, you are smoking something, new pastor. And I remember the feeling on the day Erica and I secretly were able to pay off the mortgage, and we swore each other to secrecy to not tell anybody till Sunday morning so that we could celebrate it together. But some generations will pass. Who will remember what God did by paying off a mortgage not in 5 years, but in a little over 2? You see what I'm saying? Memory fades. And I don't want to go get a mortgage out so we can pay it off again. But I want to remember what it's like when God was with us, so that in moments like maybe today, where the room is very empty and Facebook is maybe a little quieter than I wish it were, and we aren't sure if people are really being touched by the ministry of this place, that we can look and see all the lives that God has already changed and impacted and go, you know what, it's okay. God was with us through all of these things. He's with us now, and one of these days there's going to be a memory stone put in place that is going to say Pandemic 2020, the year we couldn't wait for it to end, hoping for something new. Mentioned that whole thing about childhood phone numbers. Do you remember your childhood phone number? I see one hand, two people attesting. I remember mine mostly. I'm pretty sure, well, I had to have started with 602. I grew up in Phoenix. So, anyway. But when somebody asks you for your phone number, can you just spout it off easily? Some of you. I've had mine long enough now that I've got it pretty well down, and I give it out often enough that I have it pretty well down. Ask me some other people in my family. Ask me my dad's phone number. I can tell you his home phone number because I lived there and he had the same number. cell phone number? I could look it up for you. Certainly, God has done something wonderful for you. If you're looking back and going, what has God done for me? Where was God when this happened? Or where would God? Let me just ask you this. God has done something wonderful for you because in the beginning of this day, your eyes opened. And most of you are still breathing. Some of you are even awake. Is that not a blessing of God? He created you. He gave you life. I think if you begin to really look back at your life, you would see areas where God was active, God knew what he was doing, that God put things together, and even in the midst of the bad times, God was there. The question is there a memory stone that goes along with that? Memory stone is kind of a difficult thing because I don't want you to think that I think that you should go collect a whole bunch of stones or rocks or something and start writing a name on each one of them and post. Well, you can if you want. Do you have pictures of the things that God has done in your life? When I was thinking about this, I thought, all right, what have we done to just celebrate the fact, what picture is in my mind as a memory stone for when we paid off the mortgage? Well, there's video of it. There's pictures of it. We threw a party. That's a memory stone. It's in the record books. When you look back at your life, what are the memories? Where was God so close with you? And how much of the activity of God in your life has kind of gotten away from the forefront of your mind? You see, that's the danger. That we'll get to a point where we think that we just are blessed because memories fade. Memory fades. I hope that as individuals, as a community, we will begin to be looking for these memory stones and acknowledging them. Maybe you need to make a few at least, put some dates on them. Put them somewhere where you won't forget. Second thing I would say is memory stones should be important to us today because they are intentional. They recognize in the moment that this is something worthy to be remembered. You hear what I'm saying? When you recognize the activity of God in your life, it's time for a memory stone of some sort. Journal it at the very least so that you won't forget. Memory stones should be something that we make an intentional reminder to ourselves that God is still active in the world. When memory fades, it's an intentional act that we mark it out so that in the future we will remember. Again, part of the reason why when we're all done and we can see where God was active in this moment in time, we'll be able to look back and go, we thought it was the end of the world, but God was still active. If memory fades, then it's intentional for us to use reminders to teach others about significant events. One day, my children will be telling their children, or I'll be telling my grandchildren, you should have been around in way back when in 2020. Those days were tough. It was an election year, so everybody was already mad at each other anyway. And right in the middle of it all, there came this deadly disease, and there were people afraid. The churches closed down, the stores closed down. They said, stay in your house. Some people were ruined financially. Restaurants, restaurants. If we forget, what will happen? A memory stone could be useful if something else would happen that's a little unusual. If we could look back and see where God was active in the past in these moments, we would know He's not abandoned us now. And without an intentional act to remember, we may not remember important details. Trust me, the guys that can memorize a deck of cards in 21 seconds, or whatever the number was, they don't do it accidentally. It's not like, oops, I accidentally remembered that. It's intentional. My question for you would be this: are you intentional in remembering the activity of God in your life? Are you? Oh, what sort of memory stones are you using to remember and also to tell that story? Finally, memory stones should be important to us today because remembering is actually worship. You see, I don't think you can remember what God did for you without worshiping the God who is able. Some of you at home, I didn't quite hear you. Remembering is worship because it is remembering a God who is able. Israel had lots of remembrances. All the feasts, those were times of remembrance. They were times of worship. You can think of some things that are in the sanctuary in which I'm standing. There's a cross, and that is, in fact, itself sort of a memory stone. If you use a physical Bible, if you have a physical Bible somewhere in your house, it's a wonderful memory stone. Now, I'm not saying the one in your phone isn't a wonderful tool, but I don't know how much of a memory stone it is. It's hard to look at your phone and go, oh yeah, I remember God's word. You begin to realize that there are so many ways in which we remember, and in those acts we worship a God who is worthy of being worshiped. In fact, when God says to remember, He really tells us. Jesus said what? Do this in remembrance of me. A memory stone, so to speak. And is it possible to have communion, to partake in that sort of thing without worshiping? Only if you're doing it wrong. If we forget the activity of God, I want you to remember this. We will begin to remember differently. Let's take the example of a mortgage being paid off. If we forget the activity of God in those moments, then the reason the mortgage got paid was because we were so good at collecting money. The reason the mortgage got paid was that we were so focused on a common goal. I'm not saying that those things aren't necessarily part of it. What I'm saying is that it was God. It was God. You see, when we forget that God is the hero of the story, the hero becomes us. Do you remember that time we crossed over the Jordan River? We just walked across when the land was dry. Don't know what happened. All of a sudden, we saw our opportunity and took it. We made it across, and about as soon as we got across, the river went right back to normal. Weren't we wise? That's a rewriting of the story, wouldn't you say? But we're guilty sometimes. You see, proper memory puts God in the right place. It puts Him as God. A God who loves us, a God who sends a Son to die for us, a God who does so many wonderful things for us. The same God that brought Israel out of Egypt through the wilderness and into the promised land. The same God that continuously seeks His people and brings them back to Him. The same God who gives us so many second chances even today. That's the God we worship, and the God who's in the right place when we have the right memory. That's what really matters. The final verse of chapter 4 says this: God acted so that all the people of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful. I feel like I messed that up. So that all the people of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful. And it goes on to say, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. And remember, fear not as in, oh no, I'm going to die. Fear as in, you, God, are all-powerful, almighty. You are the one who's responsible for the breath that's in me right now. You are worthy of reverence, of praise, of worship. How's your memory? Good? You get what I'm saying. If you can't tell where God did incredible things in your life, you have a homework assignment. Go home, type it out, write it out in a journal, whatever it takes. Remember how God has had a hand in your life, even when you didn't necessarily see it. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for what you've done for us, for who you are, for everything that you do so that we would have some incredible memory stones. Lord, when we think about some of the things that we see, some of the things that we know to be true, we see a God who cares so much, who loves us so much, that he is an active part of doing miracles in our lives almost daily. Help us to never forget. Help us to see these moments, these memory stones, these things where you have done incredible miracles in our lives for what they are. And may we just bask in the knowledge of knowing that even in times like this, you are still ever present. You've gone nowhere, and you're going nowhere. You're right by our side, right in our midst, and calling us to continue to remember who you are and what you've done for us. We love you. We thank you. We look forward to the opportunity to worshiping together in whatever form that will take. Once again, in your name we pray. Amen.
Thanks for watching this sermon with me. If you enjoyed your time with us, we'd invite you to join us in person for a service. Visit us at desertgrace.org or give us a call at 928-305-1132 for more information.